In Luke chapter 10, Jesus describes a man who was attacked and beaten and left half dead on the road to Jericho. Several passed by and did nothing, until finally a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Luke 10. I like to refer to this parable, not as the Good Samaritan, but as the paramedic parable, because it perfectly describes emergency medical intervention, first aid, and transport of someone who was injured. Jesus asked who was his neighbor. The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." After coming upon the scene of a tragic motor vehicle accident and not being able to do anything, then observing the less than adequate response of the local ambulance driver, I realized I had to do something. I did some research and discovered a way that I could be trained and certified as an EMT in the United States in a very short period of time. I think it was 6 weeks. I was accepted in an intensive training program with a company called Allied Signal that certified some of their own employees because of the dangerous work conditions at their manufacturing plant in Hopewell, Virginia. I signed up and flew to Richmond, Virginia, where I stayed with a local pastor and his family. I attended every class, did all the homework, did all the practical training at the local hospital emergency department, and took all the tests. By the end of the intensive course, I was amazed at how much I had learned. I passed and received my certification as an EMT in just a few weeks. My parents drove down from New Jersey, and my mom gave me a cool EMT jacket with patches and my name embroidered on it. I was excited to have gotten my certification, but I knew the real challenge was still ahead, going back home to Mexico and putting my new skills to the test in the real world. On the flight back to Mexico, I was sitting across the aisle and one row behind a young woman and who was traveling with an elderly lady. About halfway into the flight, the younger woman seemed quite upset and called for the flight attendant. Her mother was not feeling well. They asked if there was a doctor on board. I slowly raised my hand and said I was an EMT. I checked the old woman's vitals and she barely had a pulse. Within moments, she turned very pale and wasn't breathing at all. The flight attendant asked me what they should do. I told her to tell the captain to get the plane on the ground. The descent felt like an express elevator and we were almost weightless. We made an emergency landing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, while I performed CPR on this poor woman. The plane braked to a stop and emergency vehicles were on the scene. Paramedics dragged the patient down the aisle, put her on a gurney, and loaded her into an ambulance. Her daughter never left her side. Within a few minutes we were cleared for takeoff, and I was back on my way to a layover in Dallas and home to Mexico. That was my real-life initiation to real medical emergency at 35,000 feet. It appeared the elderly woman suffered a ruptured aortic aneurysm and bled internally, and probably didn't survive. Even if they were able to get her into an OR within minutes, there wasn't much that could have been done for her. I prayed for her anyway and for her poor, devastated daughter. When I got back home as a freshly certified EMT, I recruited 6 friends from our small local church. I presented them with the idea to form a volunteer rescue squad to serve the city of Cadereyta. They all agreed, and we started training right away. We called ourselves the Grupo AMAR, an acronym for Asistencia Médica, Auxilio y Rescate, Medical Assistance, Aid and Rescue, and also the Spanish verb to love. On a trip to the border, I also became certified with the American Red Cross as an instructor in first aid and CPR. At least that way I could certify the volunteers on the squad with some basic credentials. We trained for about a year, practicing everything from CPR to intubation, starting IVs, executing high-angle rescues, and much more. A church in the States donated an ambulance, and I also picked up some uniforms for us at a Goodwill. We acquired oxygen tanks, defibrillators, backboards, first aid kits, cervical collars, gloves, and everything we needed to operate a real emergency rescue squad. When we were finally all trained and ready, I drafted a letter to the mayor of Cadereyta and offered our services to the city. We met in his office at City Hall, and he was very impressed and quite pleased to accept our offer. He arranged a big inauguration ceremony in front of City Hall, at which he also gave us the city's lone ambulance, much to the dismay of the previous volunteer driver. It was an exciting time for all of us. The mayor naturally took all the credit for creating Cadereyta's first real emergency medical system. That was fine with us, as long as we got to do our job and serve the community for God's glory. The city paid for the gasoline for the ambulances. We paid for everything else ourselves. The first days of operations were uneventful, with a few minor calls now and then. But then came the weekend and parties and drinking. We were swamped with calls. Within a month, everyone on the squad was ready to quit, including me. It was clear that the 7 of us could not keep going like this. We needed more volunteers, so by word of mouth, we let it be known that we were accepting new recruits. We had a steady stream of volunteers and a rigorous, ongoing training program. We trained with real-time simulations, using volunteers to serve as victims and patients, presenting every imaginable type of trauma, accident, injury, and illness. We all memorized the map of the whole town. We finally stopped recruiting at around 40 volunteers. We set up shop in our garage as our base and dispatch center and parked the ambulances outside. We installed a radio tower on the roof. We had rotating shifts and were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The calls came in: accidents, injuries, illnesses, rescues, fires, heart attacks, suicide attempts, you name it. We added another first response vehicle to our fleet as we continued training and working with local doctors, hospitals, fire departments, law enforcement, and local churches. Over time, we became a real family, brothers and sisters called to serve our local community. It was an awesome opportunity to share the gospel with the volunteers, as well as with the people we served. By God's grace, we saved many lives, delivered babies, alleviated suffering, grieved for those we couldn't save, and demonstrated the love and mercy of God to a whole city of over 120,000 people and surrounding towns and villages for several years, before handing it over to the city as a fully trained and operational emergency medical service. Starting and operating a rescue squad was one of the most ambitious, challenging, and rewarding things I have ever been a part of. I am so blessed to have done it, but it is not something I would ever do again. It was at a time in my life when the need and the opportunity presented themselves, and in God's providence we had the resources, the contacts, and the physical and mental stamina to make it a reality. It was demanding and exhausting, and I wanted to quit many times, but God gave us the strength and the ability to carry on. I learned so much from those years. Lessons about compassion and perseverance, lessons about personal sacrifice and coping with failure and loss, dealing with disappointment, conflict, and adversity. So many experiences that the Lord used to teach me to rely upon His infinite grace in every situation. I wouldn't trade them for anything. Thank you so much for listening to this true story from Memoirs of Mexico. If you enjoyed this story, or if it was a blessing to you, please feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. That would be a blessing to me. I upload a new true story every day. If you like to read, you can also order Memoirs of Mexico in paperback or ebook on Amazon.com. There's a link in the description. Thanks again for listening.